Hi, my name is Nika Sewell-Smith, and I'm a family historian at Ancestry, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about the Freedmen's Bureau. It's a collection that has been reintroduced by Ancestry, and there is so much to talk about in terms of the possibilities when it comes to research and family history, as well as learning more about our country, and in particular, learning about African-American families right after the Civil War. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so let's qualify what we're talking about when we're talking about the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the official name of the Freedmen's Bureau is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And you have to really pay particular attention to the terms that are being used. Refugees refers to poor whites, or even potentially can be indigent free people of color as well. Freedmen would be individuals who were formerly enslaved, along with abandoned lands. And abandoned lands, of course, are lands that the owners have left, and they are literally being held in, I guess, in sort of a limbo, maybe with crops and things that are there that need to be processed. And that could potentially affect what happened in the country at the particular time that we're talking about. Now, let's qualify it even more. The Freedmen's Bureau was established by the War Department on March 3rd, 1865. And while operations did begin in some locations like parts of Virginia, South Carolina, and the Mississippi Delta, in parishes along Louisiana and counties in Mississippi, there were operations that started earlier than 1865. But the official bureau was from 1865 and went until 1872. And it was extended by two acts of Congress in 1866 and 1868. So we're really dealing with a very isolated time span, right at the end, or really close to the end of the Civil War, until 1872. So it's really important that you do your due diligence, especially if you have interest in the Freedmen's Bureau and you want to do your due diligence in tracing your ancestry back as close to 1870 as you can possibly get. If not, try to get it before that time span so that you have as much success as, much chance of success as you possibly can get researching your ancestors. Now let's talk about what the Freedmen's Bureau did. They had supervision and management of a lot of different things. And of course, in particular, all matters relating to refugees, again, that could be indigent whites, free people of color, along with freedmen who were the formerly enslaved, right? That meant dealing with them from a number of different vantage points, whether it was social things, legal things, all of that. And we're going to talk about quite a bit of that today. They were over abandoned lands. Now, I mentioned this earlier. Several slaveholders, in fact, a slaveholder in my own family line left the parish that they had land in, that they were cultivating crops in, and moved to a different parish when the Union troops came in and took control over that area. So that meant that that farm, that plantation was basically left to its own devices at that point. And, that could have been catastrophic, and considering the fact that several slaveholders did that across the country. And so in order to make sure those crops weren't lost, that the country was still able to function, the world really was still able to function, those abandoned lands began to be, managed by the Freedmen's Bureau. Confiscated lands are different. Confiscated lands are when you have someone who supported secession and they served in a military or a leadership role within the Confederacy. The federal government, the Union, came in and confiscated their property. You'll see that locations such as the Roast Home Colony, which is a Destrehan plantation, that was the property of a officer. If it wasn't an officer, I believe it was an officer of the Confederacy, and that was a part of the confiscated land. And that home colony became like home base, basically, where it was a hospital. They issued out rations to people. People worked there for sustenance and all kinds of stuff like that. Labor contracts are probably the biggest bang for your buck in terms of the Freedmen's Bureau, because they were, between landowners and their laborers, which in some instances, in most instances, those roles were switched after the war was over. So instead of being landowners and employees or laborers before the war, those individuals likely were enslaver and the formerly enslaved. And those labor contracts would set the terms of payment for services rendered, right? They would also address things like if the landowner was going to provide food and rations to the individuals who were working on their behalf. The Freedmen's Bureau would be over all of that, along with disputes and complaints regarding those labor contracts and the treatment of the individuals who were working on behalf of the landowners. Something to also point out is that we can't always assume that the labor contracts were with a former slaveholder and they're formerly enslaved. A number of people came from other parts of the country down to the South to lease plantations to keep the agricultural economy going. And so you got to do that extra due diligence to research those folks who were the landowners or the lessees to make sure that they were actually in that area prior to the Civil War and not someone who came down later and was only leasing the land. I've seen individuals, again, in the Freedmen's Bureau who actually did that. So we can't always make that assumption that the landowner was a former slaveholder. The Freedmen's Bureau also was over apprenticeship disputes and complaints, as well as the apprenticeship contracts. And this would be the scenario where you had a child who was orphaned or their parents were deemed to have not been capable of taking care of them. They would be entered into apprenticeships, very similar to what a lot of us know about indentured servitude, right? People being brought over for a term, having to serve the term, and then they are free to do what they want to do. In this instance, this is with children. And in some locations like Mississippi, the apprentice children, their former slaveholder would get first preference on apprenticing them out until they reached a certain age of majority. Now, again, the Freedmen's Bureau also dealt with not only just the contracts between the person who was being apprenticed out and who they were being apprenticed to, but as well as the disputes and the complaints regarding those apprenticeships. More, right? Because the Freedmen's Bureau is big, okay? There also were relief programs. I touched on this a little bit when I talked about the Roast Home Colony in Southern Louisiana, but the Freedmen's Bureau did give out thousands, if not millions, of rations across the country, as well as clothing. They also had hospitals. You have to remember, depending on where things were in terms of just how stuff was going in the state, there were less opportunities for the formerly enslaved to get medical care. And there could have been a skirmish or a battle or maybe some sort of an outbreak of disease, and they had no opportunities to seek medical care to make sure that they could stay alive. So the Freedmen's Bureau did operate hospitals. One of the more well-known Freedmen's Bureau hospitals that is still in existence is the one at Howard University. They also operated contraband and refugee camps. Now let's go back to that example that I just gave around former slaveholders or slaveholders at the time leaving their lands, abandoning their lands. Well, what happens with their formerly enslaved? Unless they are taken with them, they are there to do what? Maybe they work the crop still, maybe they don't. But a lot of times what would happen is those formerly enslaved, they would really self-emancipate themselves, right? And start following the Union troops and set up camp near them for safety, for maybe for sustenance, maybe for them to eat. Have food, shelter, all of those things. And so because that was happening so often, these contraband camps would be set up where they would be caring for the enslaved or the self-emancipated, really, because they were leaving, on their own volition at that point. And they also had refugee camps. And remember, refugees were a lot, that goes back to poor whites or even, free people of color could be applied to the term refugee or freedman, either way. But those camps were set up, and the Freedmen's Bureau did have oversight over those. Now, as well, there were more programs. Now, I talked about Howard University and the Howard Hospital that is still there being a Freedmen's Bureau hospital. Howard University itself is an outgrowth of the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau schools were all across the country. In fact, they were really largely financed and staffed by individuals who were sent down from benevolent organizations in the North, as well as in the Midwest, and even with individuals who were living in the local community who had the opportunity to teach who were Black, right? And so you had a lot of different individuals who will be working in the schools and supporting the schools. And the schools as well, they were not just for children, they were for adults. They were teaching literacy and reading and writing and math and all of these things. Incredible records regarding the Freedmen's Bureau schools that are out there. The Freedmen's Bureau also could provide marriages. You have to remember, marriages between the enslaved usually weren't legal. They didn't have like an actual marriage license. And so a lot of folks, ran at the opportunity to actually be legally married. And in some locations like Kentucky, they made it illegal for a man and a woman who were not married to live together. So of course there was the extra incentive to get married. So then that way you don't get in trouble. And so not only did the Freedmen's Bureau solemnize marriages or marry people, they also issue licenses to other individuals to be able to do the same. And I've found where Black men or Black ministers were given the ability to marry individuals by the Freedmen's Bureau. There also was transportation for refugees and freedmen. What does this mean? Well, I've seen instances in the Freedmen's Bureau where there was a labor shortage in fact, in Mississippi, where a lessee of land or a former enslaver or landowner was not able to procure the necessary employees to work their land. And so they reached out to the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau then would identify a group of people who needed the opportunity to work, and they would literally transport them from one state or one location to another. And in that instance I was just referring to, in Mississippi, those individuals who came to Mississippi were from North Carolina. They were from Charlotte. And the average person may be thinking, let's say they find their ancestor on the 1870 census and they see that their ancestor is living in Mississippi, but they have a birth location of North Carolina. The average person is going to make an assumption that their ancestor was brought there while enslaved. Well, what the Freedmen's Bureau is telling us is that we can't make that assumption because the ancestor may have been brought there after slavery was over, which may be why you may not be able to find this information that you've been looking for on their former enslaver, because they weren't enslaved in Mississippi. They were brought there later. Along with all these other things that the Bureau has done, we also have military, US colored troops, their bounty payments, I call it their sign-on bonus, right? For enlisting, those were administered or looked over by or not looked over, but, administered by the Freedmen's Bureau. Pensions, even back pay, all of that comes under the purview of the Freedmen's Bureau. And you'll even find enlistment records. I've seen sort of precursors to what we know as Civil War pension files that are within certain parts of the Freedmen's Bureau. It's incredible, some of the stuff that you can find connected to the US colored troops in this collection. All right, so let's look at the states of operation. And it's primarily in the southern United States, but I want to call out, of course, Delaware is included in this. Many people don't realize that the state of Delaware did not actually ratify the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, except in the instance of punishment of a crime. It was not ratified by Delaware in 1865. It was not ratified there until 1901. Slavery was fully legal in the state of Delaware. Now, granted, there were less than 2,000 individuals who were enslaved in Delaware when the Civil War started. Delaware also did not secede from the Union. So Delaware is part of the Freedmen's Bureau records because operations had to take place there, and they're wrapped in together with Maryland. But if we're talking about states that have the biggest coverage with the Freedmen's Bureau, we're talking about Virginia, which is number one, Louisiana, Georgia, and South Carolina. Those are the top 4 states of coverage, meaning that have the most records within the collection. The state that has the least is Florida, unfortunately. But don't count yourself out if you have ancestors who were living in Florida, right, during Reconstruction time span, right, or during the years of operation of the Freedmen's Bureau, because the one thing about the Bureau that folks should realize is that there were a lot of cross-state operations or a lot of cross-state documents. So just because you may only have, a small number of records and maybe at your field office or maybe even at the state level with the Bureau, that doesn't mean that your folks may not have been documented in another collection in a neighboring state. In particular, Florida has a bunch of ties to Georgia and to South Carolina in terms of documents. In fact, I even was reading about a scenario where a bunch of South Carolinians actually went down to Florida to settle there because Florida actually had the largest number of homesteads as a result of the Southern Homestead Act of 1866. So the people in South Carolina chucked the deuces and they said, no, we're going to go down to Florida. And then they encountered issues there with the applications and other things. But again, it's one of those scenarios where people may have made an assumption that their ancestors were brought down as enslaved people, but they actually left on their own volition and moved down to the state after slavery was over. So again, always keep that in mind. We can't really speak in a bunch of absolutes when it comes to that time span. So this is a table that really pretty much lays out the coverage of the Freedmen's Bureau in terms of the total number of rolls of microfilm. And these rolls of microfilm are what have been digitized and made available on Ancestry. And look at the total. It's 1,650 rolls of microfilm that span the states that cover the Freedmen's Bureau. And then at the bottom right-hand corner, take a look at the number of total rolls of microfilm for the US Census nationally. The Freedmen's Bureau collection has more rolls of microfilm than the 1860 census and the 1880 census nationally. That's how voluminous this collection is. And it's just shy, about 100 or so rolls, maybe 1,000, I don't know. My math is off, right? 100 or so rolls off of the 1870 census that we use as such a hallmark of researching African American history and genealogy. So consider that when you're looking at records in this collection, right? That this is paralleling, record sets we use all the time. That's how big this collection is. Now let's talk about the value of the Bureau. It is 110% a solid way of tracing ancestors prior to 1870. A lot of folks make it a goal to try to get to the 1870 census, as we all should. And some of us really should keep going and looking at 1860 because we may have ancestors who were free people of color and they will be documented on that census, right? But if you don't have that scenario where you are descended from free people of color, in order to really gain an idea of what our ancestors were up against and what they were experiencing, the Freedmen's Bureau does give us the opportunity to do that, because the coverage years, the years that it spans, are the 5 years, and sometimes even earlier than that, before the 1870 census. That was a crucial time. Our ancestors were establishing themselves as humans and people with rights, and determining who they wanted to work for, what they wanted to be paid, being able to have a voice to say that they didn't, that maybe they did or they didn't like certain things with regard to their employment, and choosing where they wanted to live, who they wanted to marry and have relationships with, and all that other stuff. And so this collection really, really dives deep into that time span in our history. The collection also really gives us great leads on former slaveholders. Incredible. In fact, I would say the labor contracts themselves are one of the biggest ways that you can find the name of former slaveholder, because you can look at who the landowner was, and trace that person's history and see if they come from a slaveholding family, then begin to look at probates or successions to see if you find the names of ancestors who would have been alive at that time span. Now, again, going back, we can't always assume the landowner was a slaveholder. We have to do the due diligence and do the research to find out if that was the case, but that's a very big thing. The other thing is there are a ton of lists within the Freedmen's Bureau that will list the name of the slaveholder. It'll put the person's name, and then you'll see former slaveholder. So there's no chasing down of things when the information is right there and documented by Bureau officials. We also get the day-to-day and month-to-month accounts of the lives of our ancestors. And it's in a way that, again, I just don't think you can get it anywhere else. You can see these reports that the Bureau officials are writing sometimes on a monthly basis, even letters from day to day where they're talking about the conditions in the area. Was there disease that had broken out? Was there like a labor shortage or even potentially a strike? What was going on with voting and people enacting their civic rights in that way? Any kind of relations between Black and white people at that particular point in time. And was it contentious? Did they need help or resources? All of that stuff, all this level of granularity that we are not getting in additional records like a census or a marriage license or any of the other stuff. We're getting all of those accounts within the letters and reports and all that stuff that exists in the Freedmen's Bureau. The other thing is it can really help us close the gap in Reconstruction era research. Sometimes I feel like, especially when we're researching our families, we get back to 1870 and then we go to 1880 because the census is there. We sort of skip 1890 because the census burned, right? And we go right to 1900 and we, coast on into the current time span. But there's a whole lot that happened between 1899 and 1890, and there's a whole lot that happened between 1889 and 1879, and all those time spans, right? Like, we really need to try our best to try and fill in that time period, because a lot of what happens and a lot of what we experience and a lot of things with regard to family histories and structures really get set up at that time span. And if we don't do our due diligence to try and track that information down, we're losing huge clues that could take us back further than we've gotten so far. So this is just a glimpse at the Freedmen's Bureau landing page on Ancestry, which of course, again, we have 3.5 million records in the world's largest digitized and searchable collection of Freedmen's Bureau and Freedmen's Bank records. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the bank, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. I'll have an example of that you can see, but the bank was established along with the Bureau at the same time, and the operations were handled separately. So the Freedmen's Bureau was one entity and the bank was another one, and it literally was a bank where people could deposit money, and not only just people, regular folks like adults, but children, organizations, all of that. And so we'll see an example of that now. So in order to get to the Freedmen's Bureau records on Ancestry, an easy way to do that is to visit ancestry.com/Freedmen's. And there is a search right there on the page that will take you directly to the collection. You can also go through the card catalog and search for the term Freedmen's, and it'll bring up the U.S. Freedmen's Bureau records. All right, so let's look at some examples of what you can potentially find in the Freedmen's Bureau. And I often tell people, you just don't know what in the world you are going to find in the Bureau. Like literally, like if I could potentially guess, I don't even want to do that, because I even though I've been going through this collection, for more than 14 years, I myself, I feel like I'm just now making somewhat of a tiny dent in it, but I'm still finding incredible things every single day that I was just like, wow, I didn't know this was here. So here are some of my highlights, or what I call greatest hits. All right, so this is a report of indigent and helpless freedmen in the parish of Avoyas in the state of Louisiana. And they're applying for relief from the Bureau from the 1st to the 31st of January in 1867. So this is a list of rations, or people requesting rations, right? And it's got the number in terms of when the people in the list, it's got their age, their gender identity, the name of their former slave owner is in that next column. Slaveholder right there, not guessing, right there on this list. The names of the juror reported to. Now in Louisiana, we have, instead of a board of supervisors or board of the county commission, Louisiana has police juries that are over certain wards of a particular parish or county, right? And so that's what they're talking about in terms of the juror, meaning the local person who was over the area that this individual is in, the date when reported, the date of reply, and then the substance of the reply, or what the Bureau said. And on the first line that you see in green, we also have an individual named Mary Christian, and she is 90 years old. 90. Now, if you do the math, that means that Mary is born about 1777. That's a year after the United States is founded. And here she is on this list of individuals who is receiving rations from the Freedmen's Bureau. And her slaveholder is listed as John, looks like Lambert, or maybe Saint Brett, perhaps Louisiana, it's French. And then another woman named Mary Cook, who was also 90 years old, and she's got the same slaveholder. So she's also born in 1777. And then there's a man who is also 90 years old as well, who has the same slaveholder, who is receiving rations or wants to receive rations, named Scipio Sanders. So on this one document, we've got people born in 1777, we've got their slaveholders, we've got their age, we've got a location, which is Avoyas Parish. This is 3 years before the 1870 census. And might I remind you that these individuals may not have lived long enough to get to the 1870 census. So this may be the only place we find them documented after slavery has ended. It's incredible, absolutely incredible. All right, here's another example. This is from school records, one of my favorite parts of the Freedmen's Bureau collection. This is a list of pupils transferred from the Lincoln to the Fred Douglass School on the 18th of April, 1866, with the amount of tuition paid. And this is a school that was in New Orleans. And these children who are all listed, such as Alice Abar, Charles Abar, Henry Beverly, Lucy Blatton, it looks like Charlie or Charles Barnes, William Boyd. They are all children who are going to a Freedmen's Bureau school. And you see the amount of money that they're being paid. And I love the fact that they are going from the Lincoln School to the Frederick Douglass School. I thought that was absolutely pretty awesome. So you see, again, you see them paying tuition. This is actually a long list of individuals. In fact, a number of these children that I have found were actually free people of color. They were not actually enslaved. I found them and their families on the 1860 census. So again, this goes to the point, can't assume that everybody with the Freedmen's Bureau was enslaved, right? You got to remember as well, there may be individuals who are working for the Bureau who may have been Black, maybe free people of color, or individuals who were white, who were coming from other areas, right? So it just really touches a lot of areas of life that we can look at. Here's an example. This is from Mississippi. This is a register of former slaves. It does not have a date, but notice in green is 51-year-old Richard Christmas. And it lists his physical attributes along with his occupation as a foreman. It says that he lives at Twin Oaks Plantation, which is in Copiah County, Mississippi, and that his former slaveholder is a man named Calvin or Calvert Roberts, and that his former residence is where he is living now, which is near Hazelhurst, Mississippi. Again, not going around trying to find former slaveholders, looking for all kinds of clues. Here is a list right here. And again, this is not just in Mississippi. It's not even just in Louisiana. It's in Virginia. It's in the Carolinas. There are lists all over the collection. And literally, I would want to say almost every state that, that has the former slaveholder's name. Now, it won't be this list in every county in every state. That's not the case. But there are a number of different circumstances or situations where you will have these lists and they will have the former owner or slaveholder's name right there. Here's another example. This is from the Freedmen's Bank records. This is from Huntsville, Alabama. It is the record for Charles Miller Coleman. He applied to get an account at the Freedmen's Bank on October 2nd, 1867. And it says that he formerly lived in Virginia. Now, remember, this bank record is in Alabama, but it's noting that Charles lived in Virginia. It says that he has been in Huntsville or in Alabama for some 33 years. So that means that if we do the math, right, since the 1830s, he's been in Alabama, even though he's from Virginia. It says he's 56. It mentions his father's name is John Cutching, and he's got a wife named Susan. They list the children, their ages out. Look at that. Look at that incredible information that they have. His place of birth, which is Brunswick County, Virginia, along with where he lives, which is near the Baptist church, just over the fence. Oh, my Lord, that just makes me that's just tickles me. He lives just over the fence of the Baptist church. His occupation is planting. And note the remarks. This is the part of this deposit card that got me. It says, has not seen family in 35 years. Brother Ben and Jack and Alec and Moses, who is dead, Robert and William, sister Susan and Sally, all left in Virginia, but Alec, who was sold away first. So we have a date from where he has been in the state of Alabama. We know that his brother Alec was sold away first. Then we have the names of his parents, and maybe Cutching may be his mother's name because it's listed over his mom's name right there above. But we have the list of his parents, we have his parents' names, his siblings' names, the fact that he lived in Virginia, he's living in Alabama, his brother was sold away first, but the rest of the family is there in Virginia. All of this from a deposit slip or application in the Freedmen's Bank. More records. Let's look at some more. This is from one of my favorite subsets of the Freedmen's Bureau, M2029. This is all the business of the Bureau after the Bureau officially closed in 1872. So that means that these records are going to be connecting to individuals who still had businesses they needed to deal with, with the Bureau. And a lot of times these are going to be veterans of the U.S. colored troops. And in this letter, which is addressed to Captain H.S. Hawkins of the 6th Infantry, it notes, Captain, I acknowledge the receipt of your letter of the 6th instant explaining certain circumstances under which the amount of $70.23 due to Eliza McLaurin as sister of Carol Bell, deceased, late Private Company F, 110th Regiment U.S. Colored Troops. This means that Eliza was the sister of Carol Bell, who was a veteran of the USCT, and that he was due pay and she was petitioning to get her brother's pay on his behalf. So again, I love M2029. I love the after Bureau collection of records because it's incredible. It's got great stuff. And again, that part of the collection goes after the dates, the official dates of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, here's an example of a labor contract. At the top, we have the name William McCulloch. And here's the thing with labor contracts. Every state, and even going from parish to parish or even field office to field office, which is at the extreme local level of the Freedmen's Bureau, the labor contracts are not always going to look the same. In the state of Louisiana, for the most part, they're going to all be on this particular form. But if you go to Mississippi or even you go to Arkansas, they're not going to look exactly like this. They may be entirely handwritten. It really all depends, right? Just like how things are different from state to state now, is the same way with the Freedmen's Bureau. So on February 5th, 1867, we have this labor contract between William McCulloch of Carroll Parish, and he is at the Cottonwood Plantation. And if you go down the page, notice that there are a number of people who are on this labor contract who also have the last name McCulloch. There's Alfred McCulloch, who's age 30, Sam McCulloch, who's age 35, Ottawa McCulloch, who's age 50, and Alice McCulloch, who is age 30. Now, I had a particular interest in this because Ottawa McCulloch was a witness on my great-great-grandparents' marriage license. So I always wondered if he, when my great-great-grandparents got married in 1874, I was wondering if he was enslaved with them or, what the exact tie was for him to serve as a witness. And it doesn't appear that he was, but he also was in a number of Freedmen's Bureau records. So that gave me the opportunity to learn more about those witnesses in hopes of trying to figure out what their exact connection was to my family, because McCulloch is not a surname that we have in our family. All right, and this is an example of a marriage from Arkansas. This is a report of marriages of freedmen in the District of Arkadelphia from Captain W, or it looks like William A. Stewart, Superintendent of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, during the month ending October 31st, 1865. And in green, on October 1st, 1865, Haywood Ings of Clark County marries Caroline Barkham of Clark County. And Haywood is age 36. They give his, physical descriptions along, not with just his parents' physical descriptions. And then one of my favorite parts of this form is lived with another woman. How many years? And it says 3 months. Haywood was living with another woman and that they separated by removal. I don't know what happened, but somebody was removed. Then it notes that Caroline is only 16. He's 36, Caroline is 16. It gives her physical description and the description of her parents in terms of their complexion. She was not living with another man. And then it gives you a number of children united, right? If the number of kids came together, they have that as well. And then they also have the name of the officiating minister, which in this instance is P.M. Carmichael, Justice of the Peace. So there's a ton of information. You can read in a lot of different ways on what's going on this marriage, this list of marriages. But again, this is a lot of granular detail we're getting prior to 1870 that you just really cannot get for the most part elsewhere. So I hope that this presentation really illuminated for you how you can use the Freedmen's Bureau, leads that you can gain from the Bureau, as well as all the information that you can glean from this incredible record set. And I hope that you are successful in your finds and your searches, and that you are able to break through brick walls and get your family history to a level that that you have been dreaming and hoping for. Thanks.